Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. He was born by the walls of a hospital and lived his life between suffering and hope. He passed through a sentence of death, penal labor, poverty, loss, and love, and all of this became the pages of his books. In this video, we will tell the story of how Dostoevsky was shaped, a man who discovered meaning in suffering and depth in the human soul, how a youthful dreamer became a prophet of pain, how he rode on the edge of despair, how he sought God, and what he left behind. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. A warm, early evening settled over Moscow. In one of the narrow streets lined with the homes of civil servants and physicians, the windows of the service apartments attached to the Mariinsky Hospital stayed lit long into the night. It was there, in one of the apartments belonging to the hospital administration, that in November of the year 1821 the second son of the staff doctor Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky was born, a boy named Fyodor. The house in which he grew up stood close to the hospital buildings for the poor, and every day little Fedya heard the ambulance cart bringing new patients, heard the moans of the dying, heard someone crying behind a wall. His early childhood unfolded in this strange space, between life and death, between suffering and indifference, between the sternness of his father and the tenderness of his mother. And though he was only 5 or 6 years old, he already sensed that the world was not just walks and holidays, but also pain, fear, and a deep, almost inexplicable pity. His father, Mikhail Andreevich, was a stern, irritable, stubborn, and domineering man. He served as a doctor for the poor, yet at home, he was strict to the point of cruelty. He wanted his children to be educated, religious, respectful, and he punished them for the slightest liberty, with a word, a glance, sometimes a strap. His mother, by contrast, was quiet, gentle, and frail. She read the children the gospel, the children's Bible, folk stories, and the lives of the saints. She did not educate. She loved. It was from her that Fyodor inherited that quiet, painful, almost religious sensitivity to the suffering of others, which would remain with him for life. Together with him in the family grew his brother Mikhail, older by 1 year, and 2 younger sisters. Mikhail was his first real friend and his only companion in childhood. The brothers shared not only toys and books, but also thoughts, fears, and dreams. They began reading early, at first fairy tales, then Pushkin, Tchaikovsky, Karamzin. Later, already in adolescence, Fyodor became fascinated with Schiller, whose ideas about duty, suffering, and inner heroism left an indelible impression on him. Life inside the hospital walls, not in the wards, but in the shadow of the odors and sounds of illness, left a deep mark on the boy's soul. He saw the orderly throw out blood-soaked sheets in the morning. He heard crying in the courtyard, a woman who had not reached her dying husband in time. He knew that behind a thin wall someone might be drawing their last breath. He knew that life was fragile as a single breath. It did not frighten him. It taught him compassion. But this atmosphere also gave birth to fear. Fear of his father, fear of the future, fear of the harsh necessity of being as one must. Once when Fyodor was reading a book under his blanket, his father tore it from his hands and shouted, "Learn your catechism first, and only then German fantasies." Yet precisely those German fantasies, as it would later become clear, planted in the boy a capacity to dream and suffer at the same time. His mother began to wither in the early 1830s. The illness lasted long and drained her. When she grew very weak, the children already understood that she could not be saved. She died in the spring of the year 1837, when Fyodor was 15 years old. It was his first true loss, his first collision with inevitability. After her death, the home grew empty. His father withdrew into himself, became more irritable and sullen. A wall of distrust grew between him and the children. 2 years later, in the year 1839, news came of his father's death. He was then at his small estate in the Tula province. The official cause was a stroke, but rumors spread among the peasants that the serfs, unable to endure his harshness, had taken revenge. Fyodor himself would later not rule out this possibility. He never spoke of it aloud, but in his prose the motif of the father's murder would echo, like a shadow, like a subconscious trace of this tragedy. After the parents' deaths, the brothers were taken to St. Petersburg. They were placed in the main engineering school, a state institution that trained military engineers. Officially, it was to give them a profession. Unofficially, it was to save them from poverty and isolation. Thus ended Fyodor Dostoevsky's Moscow period. But before he would begin to write, before he would lose his mind over debts, before penal labor, Europe, love, and revelation awaited him, he had to pass through the shadows of his childhood. There, by the walls of the Mariinsky Hospital, he saw suffering for the first time, and forever made it the heart of his literature. The city he arrived in as a youth greeted him with autumn cold, a low sky, icy dampness, and strict architecture looming over the streets like a stone omen St. Petersburg did not comfort, did not invite, did not encourage. But in this city, Fyodor Dostoevsky felt for the first time that here, in these streets, in this lamplight, amid detachment and silence, lived a certain truth, bitter but necessary. At the age of 17, he was enrolled in the main engineering school, a closed state institution training military engineers. His brother Mikhail left to study at Moscow University, while Fyodor, after the death of both parents, was placed there through the state system. There he had lodging, food, textbooks, enough to save him from poverty. But from the first months he felt he was not where he wished to be. The studies came hard to him. Mathematics and technical drawing oppressed him. He worked diligently but without inspiration. The strict logic of formulas evoked melancholy. But literature, philosophy, history, these he seized with hunger. Between lectures he read, first Pushkin, then Zhukovsky, later Gogol, Schiller, and Hugo. He was especially shaken by works in which suffering turned into a path toward truth, toward faith, toward humanity. He dreamed more and more not of service but of becoming a writer. Dostoevsky graduated from the school with the rank of sub-lieutenant in the spring of the year 1843. A few months later, he submitted his resignation. It was a turning point. He refused a stable career and chose a path with no money, no guarantees, no certainty. He rented a modest room on the outskirts and began to write, from morning to night, without a plan, without editors, without support. Only a notebook, ink, and the torturous sensation that each word either brought him closer to or further from his goal. In the first months he survived on small translations, mostly of Hugo and Balzac. The work paid miserably, but enough to keep him from starving. He lived very poorly. He ate cheap soups, was often sick, and froze in winter. In letters to his brother he confessed, "I am alone. I am poor. I dream." It was then that he began working on the novel that would change his life. Poor Folk. The tale, written in the form of correspondence between two lonely and impoverished people, took shape slowly. He was unsure it was even worth publishing. When he finished, he gave the manuscript to an acquaintance, the young writer, Dmitry Grigorovich. After reading it, Grigorovich was stunned. He immediately took the manuscript to Vissarion Belinsky, the most influential critic of the era. Belinsky read through the night. In the morning he summoned Grigorovich and said, "This is our Gogol of a new direction." Fyodor was 24 years old when he awoke famous. They told him Belinsky was ecstatic. He was invited to gatherings. He came shy, poorly dressed, but people had assembled specifically to see him. Belinsky said, "You have begun with what others end." The young writer was overwhelmed. He could not believe fame had come, and feared it would vanish. Poor Folk was printed in Nekrasov's Petersburg collection and caused a sensation. They spoke of the birth of a new school. They compared him to Gogol. But Dostoevsky himself felt inner anxiety. He feared he could not repeat his success. His next novel, The Double, was met coolly. Critics did not understand it. Belinsky was disappointed. Readers were silent. He fell into deep confusion. Meanwhile, he continued to live in poverty. His income was almost non-existent. Translation fees were tiny. He borrowed money, wrote promissory notes, felt ashamed, asked his brother for help. He changed apartments several times, often slept in his coat, grew ill, suffered insomnia. His suffering was not theatrical. It was real. He experienced anxious attacks, sometimes like migraines, sometimes like vague premonitions of the illness that would soon reveal itself as epilepsy. He was alone. No love, no family, not even a reliable friend. There were acquaintances, occasional visits, evenings at friends' homes, but inwardly, he felt alienated. He did not find himself among the bohemians, nor among civil servants, nor among students. He increasingly wrote about people who, like him, lived on the edge. Poor, superfluous, nervous, searching for meaning in suffering. He thought much about God, freedom, conscience, humanity. He did not yet dare to place these reflections openly in his fiction, but the images were already forming. Raskolnikov, Prince Mishkin, Ivan Karamazov, their roots were already pulsing in his notebooks and drafts. He did not know that he would soon be drawn into ideas of transforming society. He did not know he would join circles discussing the reform of the world. He did not know he would one day be arrested. For now, he simply lived, poor, tormented, proud, lonely, in a city where the clatter of hooves on the cobblestones and the light of a street lamp in his window were the only witnesses to his slowly unfolding fate. After the painful silence into which Dostoevsky sank following the cool reception of The Double, he began spending more time in places where the conversations were not about literature, but about the future of Russia, about its conscience, duty, lack of freedom, and what a just society ought to be. He did not yet know that these conversations would become not only the reason for his arrest, but would lead him, literally, to the wall of execution. One such place was the apartment of Mikhail Butashevich Petrashevsky. Every Friday evening, young civil servants, students, physicians, translators gathered there to discuss the ideas of European utopians: Fourier, Saint-Simon, Owen, Schelling. Among the attendees were bright, educated people who sincerely believed that Russia could change, peacefully, through enlightenment, the abolition of serfdom, court reform, and better education. The meetings usually amounted to philosophical debates, the reading of banned books, and sometimes emotional speeches about the fate of the people. No conspiracies were plotted, no weapons stored, but the atmosphere of St. Petersburg in the mid-century left no room even for peaceful allegory. Dostoevsky was not a regular member of the circle. He came rarely, listened more than he spoke, but the evenings revealed something in him. He was not interested in blueprints of the future. He was tormented by the pain of the present. When he read aloud to his friends a handwritten copy of the famous Belinsky letter to Gogol, a passionate, harsh text accusing Gogol of betraying the duty of the artist, he felt that these words mattered because they held truth. It was this letter, banned by censors, that became the formal basis for opening the case. In April of the year 1849, he was arrested. Early in the morning, they knocked at his door. After searching his room and seizing his papers and manuscripts, they took him under guard to the third section, and then to a solitary cell in the Alexeyevsky Ravelin of the Peter and Paul fortress. There he spent 8 months. The investigation proceeded unbearably slowly. He was accused of participating in an anti-government circle, spreading harmful writings, and inciting the undermining of the foundations of autocracy. Dostoevsky did not deny reading Belinsky's letter or taking part in discussions, but insisted he was not involved in any conspiracy, had no plans of revolt, and belonged to no secret organization. But the investigation was conducted under the shadow of the European revolutions that swept across the continent that same year. Tsar Nicholas I demanded severity. Any word that strayed from official loyalty was deemed criminal. He was alone in his cell, no books, no letters, no news. Years later, he would write that this was a state of frozen soul, when nothing brings joy, yet fear also recedes, because everything is decided somewhere outside you. The only source of light was the gospel, a small book secretly brought to him by the wife of one of the Decembrists. He read it every night, learning some chapters almost by heart. This text became his only companion and guide, not only during those months, but for many years ahead. In November of that year, the verdict in the Petrashevsky case was delivered. Dostoevsky, together with 20 other participants, was sentenced to death. A few weeks later, on the morning of the 22nd of December, they were brought to the Semenovsky Square. It was bitterly cold, the sky hung low and murky, the ground was covered with ice. The condemned wore white death shirts. The sentence was read aloud. Several had already had their eyes covered, their hands tied. Soldiers stood ready with their rifles. Dostoevsky was in the next group. He was certain he was about to die. He later recalled, "There remained only a few minutes to live, and one thought, you exist, and soon you will not." He said goodbye to his mother, to his brother, to the sky, to his childhood. He looked at the attics, at a sparrow, at a broken lantern, and felt that all of this was for the last time. He thought that if only he could live a bit longer, even 5 minutes, he would live them as an eternity. And at that very moment, the drama unfolded. An officer arrived with the emperor's order. The execution was to be cancelled. The sentences were commuted. Dostoevsky's death sentence was replaced with 4 years of penal labor, followed by service as a soldier. All of this had been staged in advance, planned by Nicholas I. The purpose was to break the will of the condemned, to demonstrate mercy at the final second, an act of imperial power. For Dostoevsky, this was not simply salvation. It was death followed by life. He had already died on that square. Everything that came before, literature, convictions, youthful pride, collapsed. Only bare, trembling, barely breathing life remained, like a miracle. And he accepted this miracle not as the Tsar's mercy, but as a mysterious turning of destiny. After the reprieve, he returned to the fortress for a short time. He was allowed to take with him to exile only his clothes and a single book, the same gospel he had held in prison. Soon he was to be sent to Siberia, not as a traveler, but as a man deprived of his name, rank, and rights. He did not yet know that ahead lay the Omsk penal prison, shackles, military service, cold, humiliation, the ban on writing, epileptic seizures. But he knew that if he had remained alive, then it must be for something. And in this feeling there was no pride, only a heavy, almost Christian acceptance. The road to Siberia was long. The convict transport dragged on for weeks, with stops in district prisons and stockades, with cold, sleepless nights, guards, shackles, and the constant smell of smoke, soaked straw, and filthy clothing. For Fyodor Dostoevsky, who only recently had been sitting at his writing desk in a Petersburg apartment, this was not simply a change of place. It was a passage into a completely different reality, where his former personality seemed to be reset to zero, where there was no literature, no honor, not even a name. He had become simply a convict, one among thousands. In the summer of the year 1850, he arrived at the fortress of Omsk, one of the harshest penal prisons of the Russian Empire. Criminals, murderers, rebels, runaways, repeat offenders, serfs convicted of attacking their landowners were held there. Stone barracks, low ceilings, stench, overcrowded bunks, an icy floor in winter and unbearable heat in summer, in a cell designed for 20 people. More than 50 men lived. There was no such thing as a fixed bed. Whoever went out to work would find his place taken by someone returning from another shift. Light barely entered the windows. There were more rats there than books in the entire prison. Dostoevsky found himself surrounded by people with whom, at first glance, he had nothing in common. He was a nobleman, a former officer, a writer, fragile, sickly, withdrawn. The others were rough, strong, hardened, often illiterate. At first they treated him with suspicion, mocked his manner of speaking, his accent, his clumsiness at heavy labor. They threatened him, tested him for weakness, bullied him. But he kept silent, endured, never complained. He shared bread, listened, helped with small things. Over time they began to take him seriously. He became friends with several prisoners. One of them was a former peasant, convicted of killing a landowner after the man had violated his wife. Another was an elderly old believer, a wanderer and man of few words, who knew the Psalter by heart. A third was a repeat thief with crooked fingers, who could repair any lock, and who made the sign of the cross 3 times every morning before taking a spoon in hand. These people were not romanticized. Dostoevsky did not justify them, but he saw in them more than criminals. He learned to see human beings broken, frightened, embittered, but alive. The work was hard. In winter, clearing snow, breaking ice, hauling logs. In summer, earthworks, moving bricks, digging pits, cleaning cesspools, all of it in shackles, with heavy iron chains on their legs. He lacked physical strength, was often ill, and fainted more than once. Yet he never asked for mercy. On the contrary, he tried to show that he was no worse than the others. Sometimes he even tried to defend those being beaten. This earned him respect. The only book he was allowed to keep was the Gospel. It had been given to him by Natalia von Vizina, the wife of a Decembrist. This book became his sole support, and as he later admitted in letters, he reread it so many times that he knew certain chapters by heart. He did not become religious in the strictly ecclesiastical sense, but his faith grew stronger, as a deep, silent acceptance of suffering as a path, not as punishment, as a path. He wrote almost nothing. He was forbidden to do so, but he memorized, observed, listened. He stored in his memory the expressions on faces, conversations, smells, gestures, manners. Later he would say, "The fortress of Omsk became for me a university of the human soul." He stopped seeing in a person only a biography. He learned to feel, beneath the surface of anger, despair, beneath mockery, pain, beneath coarseness, the fear of being rejected. Letters were a torment. He was allowed to write rarely and under strict censorship. He wrote to his brother Mikhail. His letters were short, but always composed, without complaints, without hysterics. He wrote, "Life is life everywhere, and in it there is meaning. Simply not to die is already a joy." These words were not bravado. He had truly changed. The man who had stood beneath the gallows on Semenovsky Square had died. The one who lived in Omsk was already someone different. Among other things, the symptoms of epilepsy began to manifest during his penal servitude. The first seizure occurred in his sleep, the others by day, at work. After one such attack, they dragged him to a corner, splashed him with water, and that was all. There was no treatment. Yet the illness became part of his being. He accepted it. He learned to live in expectation of a fall. Later, this inner anxiety would become a crucial part of the portraits of his characters. In February of the year 1854, after 4 years of penal servitude, his term was officially completed. By imperial decree, he was transferred as a private to a Siberian line battalion stationed in Semipalatinsk. There he was to continue serving his sentence as a soldier under strict supervision, without the right to leave his place of service. He left Omsk, and for the first time in 4 years walked out into the street without chains. He did not know where fate would lead him next, but he knew that he was alive, and that was already enough. After 4 years of penal servitude and several years of military service in Siberia, Fyodor Dostoevsky, by a personal decree, received permission to return to Central Russia. This happened at the beginning of the year 1859. First he stayed in Tver, then, briefly, in Moscow, and finally in the autumn of that same year, he arrived in St. Petersburg. The city where his literary destiny had once begun now greeted him coldly, almost indifferently. Everything had changed. Old names had vanished. New ones did not know him. He was free, but poor, almost without means, without a permanent home, without a job. Rented rooms, debts, poor health, constant epileptic seizures. He coughed, lost weight, suffered insomnia, and looked for a way to re-enter the literary world. His brother Mikhail helped him. They grew close again. Mikhail already had connections with publishers, handled business matters, and was interested in journalism. Together they began to plan a new periodical. At the same time, Dostoevsky was working on his first major work after his imprisonment. This was Notes from the House of the Dead, a tale based on his memories of penal servitude. It was neither memoir nor document, but it contained everything he had brought away from Omsk: faces, fates, suffering, reconciliation. He wrote slowly and cautiously, disguising real names in order to avoid attacks from the censors. The first part was published in the year 1860. It immediately struck a chord. Readers were shaken. Until then, the criminal in Russian literature had usually been either a villain or a caricatured figure punished by fate. Dostoevsky showed in the criminal a human being. He did not justify, but he looked closely. He gave a voice to those who had none. This compassion, restrained and profound, set him apart from everything else being written at the time. There appeared a hope that his literary reputation would return. In the year 1861, the Dostoevsky brothers launched the journal Time. Fyodor became its de facto editor. He wrote articles, essays, and reviews, personally conducted correspondence with authors, and edited texts. In this journal he would publish notes from the House of the Dead, as well as the novels Humiliated and Insulted, a nasty anecdote, and also translations and philosophical pieces. But the work was exhausting. Money was lacking. The journal required expenses. The printing house demanded advances. Writers needed to be paid. Mikhail took out loans, sought sponsors, negotiated with the censors. Fyodor wrote day and night. He filled the pages not only with serious prose, but with humorous notes just to make up the required volume. He lived in ceaseless anxiety. If an issue was delayed, everything would collapse. At the same time, his health worsened. The epilepsy grew stronger. Attacks became more frequent, and one occurred right in the street in front of passers-by. More than once he lost consciousness, fell, thrashed in convulsions, and afterward lay for a long time, unable to speak. In letters to Mikhail, he confessed, "I do not fear death. I fear that I will not have time." He worked with desperate concentration, sometimes for 20 hours in a row. In the year 1863, the journal Time was closed, for reasons of censorship. One of the published pieces served as the official cause. The loss of the periodical was a blow. The income vanished. Mikhail tried to maintain his connections. Fyodor tried to save at least part of the editorial archive. The following year, Mikhail suddenly died, from an illness that progressed rapidly. Dostoevsky, devastated, shocked, penniless, was left not only without his brother but also without his last pillar of support. He tried to begin again. He launched a new journal, Epoch. There he published stories, translations, and continued his editorial work. He printed winter notes on summer impressions, The Crocodile, and began work on the novel Notes from Underground. But the project did not last long. The financial situation became catastrophic. Debts multiplied. Creditors pursued him. Several times he was on the verge of being thrown into a debtor's prison. To avoid arrest, he moved from apartment to apartment, hid, and signed papers with backdated signatures. He wrote in despair. He worked on several texts at once, hoping that at least one would be sold. Publishers cheated him, paid less than they had promised he had to borrow, pawn his belongings, sell furniture. Once he pawned the watch his brother had given him just to buy candles and finish a story. He said, "If they do not pay me by Wednesday, I shall have nothing to eat." He was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. Yet inwardly the work did not stop. And it was precisely in this period that he arrived at the philosophical and psychological themes that would make his later novels great: sin, freedom, compassion, guilt, suffering as a path, faith as courage. He lived all this not as a thinker, but as a human being. That is why every word he wrote began to sound different. He felt that he could not go on living like this. He was on the edge. Illness, debt, loneliness. In his mind, the idea of escape was taking shape. Escape, at least for a while, from Russia, from creditors, from pressure. He dreamed of Europe, of rest, of simple human peace. But he did not yet know how to make this happen. Nor did he know that very soon he would meet the person who would help him not only leave the country, but return to himself. After Mikhail's death, the collapse of the journal, mounting debts, and severe seizures, Dostoevsky found himself in a state of extreme despair. There was no money. Publishers refused his texts or postponed payment. Court summonses followed one after another. To avoid a debtor's prison, he signed a contract with the Petersburg publisher Fyodor Timofeyevich Stilovsky. According to the agreement, he was obliged to complete and deliver a new novel of no fewer than 12 printed sheets by the 1st of November of the year 1865. Otherwise, Stoevsky would receive the rights to publish all of the writer's future works for a period of 9 years without any additional payment. Less than 1 month remained. He could no longer work alone. Seizures, exhaustion, and the slowness of handwriting interfered. He therefore decided to seek the help of a stenographer. On a friend's recommendation, he invited a 20-year-old graduate of stenography courses, Anna Grigorievna Schnitkina. Their first meeting took place in October of the year 1865. She came to his rented room, sat quietly down with her notebook, and he began to dictate the novel, The Gambler. They worked every day, often for many hours, in anxiety at the limits of their strength. He did not simply dictate. He lived through each scene, exclaimed, jumped up, broke off, returned to the text, explained. Sometimes dictation was interrupted by a seizure or an emotional breakdown. She remained calm. She wrote down everything, kept her composure, never objected. After 26 days, the novel was finished. He had made it in time. Shortly after finishing the manuscript in early January of the year 1866, he proposed to Anna. Without confidence, without ceremony, simply during a walk, he told her he was poor, ill, and 20 years older. She was silent and asked for time to think. A few days later, she agreed. The wedding took place in February of the year 1866 in the Trinity Church on Mozhaiskaya Street. A few months after the wedding, they left Russia. There were several reasons. He hoped to improve his health, escape his creditors, and gain the chance to write in peace. They left the country in July of the year 1867 and would spend almost 4 years abroad. First Dresden, then Geneva, Vienna, Basel, Baden-Baden, and again, Geneva. They lived modestly. Money was short. At times, she kept record of every single coin. He suffered from epilepsy, was often irritable and impatient. He began to gamble again, this time seriously. In Baden-Baden, he lost everything they had, including her ring. Then he begged forgiveness, swore never to repeat it. A few weeks later, he was gambling again. She did not leave. She handled correspondence, delivered manuscripts, met with publishers, wrote letters to his dictation. When he could not write, she took the pen. When he could not dictate, she read aloud. When he lost control, she remained silent. In March of the year 1868, their daughter Sophia was born in Geneva. The little girl died at 3 months of age. They lived through this in silence. He wrote in his diary, "We saw love die and survived." The following year, in the year 1869, their daughter Lyubov was born. Later, in the year 1871, their son Fyodor was born. In exile, he continued to write. He began to accumulate the ideas for his future novels. He thought about a man who commits a crime for the sake of an idea, pondered mental illness, innocence, Russian revolt. He spoke with Anna about his characters, read her chapters, asked her opinion. She became his co-author in the deepest sense, not in a literary, but in a human one. In Europe, Dostoevsky enjoyed the humiliation of poverty, the bitterness of failure, the acute phases of illness, but it was here that his main support was born. Anna did not merely accompany him, she held his whole life together at his side. From that moment on, she would be his secretary, housekeeper, editor, publisher, the mother of his children, and the only person before whom he was not ashamed to be weak. When in the year 1871 they returned to Russia, he was no longer the man who had left. He knew that ahead lay enormous labor. He knew that the debts had not vanished. He knew that his illnesses had not gone away. But he also knew that now he had at his side the person who would help him complete the work for which he had been spared. After returning to Russia at the beginning of the year 1871, Dostoevsky understood that he was entering the final stretch. He was over 50 years old. His epilepsy was progressing. The hardships he had endured, the poverty, the exhaustion, all of this had accumulated. But along with the weariness, there grew in him an inner sense of necessity. He was no longer searching for a form. He already knew what he had to say. First of all, he returned to the idea he had been contemplating while abroad. It concerned a man who commits murder not for gain, but for the sake of a theory. Thus arose the conception of the novel Crime and Punishment, which was published in the journal The Russian Messenger throughout the year 1866. He created the character of Rodion Raskolnikov, a poor, intelligent, withdrawn man, convinced that the moral law can be overstepped for the sake of a higher goal. For Dostoevsky, this was not simply a novel about a crime. It was an exploration of the human mind, of loneliness, pride, and inner guilt. St. Petersburg in the novel appears as a suffocating, enclosed, dark space in which neither science, nor convictions, nor logic can save anyone. Only the acceptance of suffering, only the path through repentance, can lead to rebirth. After Crime and Punishment, he began work on the next novel. He wanted to show the opposite, not downfall, but light. In the year 1868, he started writing The Idiot, which was published in the following year, 1869. At its center stands Prince Myshkin, a man without malice, without a mask, without fear. He enters a society in which sincerity is incomprehensible, kindness seems like madness, and compassion is taken for weakness. Writing the novel was difficult. Dostoevsky doubted himself, lost his temper, rewrote chapters. He felt that the figure of an ideal man, when placed in reality, arouses mistrust, and that it is precisely in this conflict that the tragedy lies. Mishkin cannot survive among people who are destroyed by lies, envy, and coldness. And although critics did not receive the novel with a single voice, Dostoevsky himself considered The Idiot one of his most important experiments. Then came the time of his harshest and most frightening novel. In the year 1872, he published the first part of Demons, finishing the work in the next year, 1873. Here there is no salvation and no illumination. It is a story of destruction. The characters are people possessed by ideas, but who have lost their souls. At the core lies a real case of a political murder. Yet Dostoevsky does not limit himself to a chronicle of events. He shows how, under the guise of liberation, destruction arrives, how an idea without love becomes a force of death. The novel became a political, philosophical, and spiritual statement. He felt that Russia was entering a period in which the struggle of ideas could eclipse compassion, and he wished to warn, if the spirit is driven out of life, demons will take its place. After Demons, he wrote The Adolescent, published in the year 1875. It is a chamber novel in which he returns to the theme of inner growth and the collision of youth with the world. The protagonist, Arkady Dolgoruki, seeks a formula for power, but runs up against a moral dead end. This novel is often underestimated, yet in it one can already hear the tones of a future confession. And then, the most important work begins. In the year 1878, he sets to work on The Brothers Karamazov. He tells Anna, "This is my main book." He conceives the novel in several parts, as a philosophical epic about good and evil, faith and unbelief, family, power, freedom, and redemption. But he will only manage to write the first part. He works slowly and thoughtfully. He writes almost every day. He rises early, dictates, rereads, edits. He knows his strength is limited. He says he wants at least to finish this book. At the center stands the story of the Karamazov family. The father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, is depraved, cruel, and destructive. His sons are Dmitri, passionate and uncontrollable, Ivan, cold and intellectual, and Alyosha, believing, gentle, and searching. Through their fates, he reflects on the nature of evil, on the suffering of a child, on freedom that makes a person unhappy. He creates the legend of the Grand Inquisitor. One of the most astonishing chapters in Russian literature, he gives us Elder Zosima, an image of quiet strength and compassionate faith. He offers no simple answers, but creates a space in which every reader comes face to face with their own doubts. The novel was published in the year 1881. Readers were in awe. Critics wrote more reservedly, but everyone understood. This was a summit he himself already felt that he had done what he had lived for. He often said that this book was a result but not an ending. He dreamed of continuing it. He said that Alyosha would still have a path to walk. He made plans, wrote down fragments. But his health was failing. He was tired. And he said with increasing frequency to Anna, "If only I can finish this. Everything else does not matter." He felt the approach of the end, but he was not afraid. His home became a place of quiet, concentration, and collectedness. He still received visitors, but rarely. He spent most of his time with his son, with his books, with his thoughts. He did not hurry. He had already said what mattered most. In the winter of the year 1881, St. Petersburg lay under snow. The city that had once been hostile and indifferent to the young writer had now become a quiet refuge, where everything had finally taken its proper place. The apartment on Kuznechny Lane was modest but lived in. Everything there obeyed a single rhythm: morning hours of dictation, daytime correction of manuscripts, evening reading, and silence, unbroken by anything superfluous. His son Fedya was growing up in the next room. Anna took care of the household, the publishing business, the correspondence, and the preparation of new editions. The last weeks of Dostoevsky's life were not burdened by unbearable pain, but one could feel the weariness in them. He spent long periods in silence, read the Gospel, his own copy, with personal notes, worn, with pages darkened at the edges. It was the only book to which he returned again and again. He said that only in this book did he find a final meaning. From time to time visitors came, but such meetings were rare and brief. He no longer needed proof of his significance. He simply knew that he had said the essential things. On the evening of the 27th of January, he felt unwell. He had begun to write a letter to the editor of a journal. He intended to respond to criticism of the brothers Karamazov. Feeling a sharp weakness and pain, he broke off work. By morning, a pulmonary hemorrhage had begun. The doctors realized that this was the final worsening of his emphysema and chronic bronchitis, followed by a powerful seizure. He himself understood that this was the end. He asked that a priest be summoned. He confessed. He took communion. He turned to Anna and said, "Do not cry. You know how I have loved you." He spoke a few words to his son, quietly and calmly. Later, to the doctor leaning over him, he said, "Today I shall die." This happened in the evening of the 28th of January, in the 59th year of his life. The news spread quickly. By the very next morning, several Petersburg newspapers had reported his death. One appeared with the headline, "The prophet is gone." Another with a brief line, "Dostoevsky is dead, but no one will forget him." The stream of visitors began at once. At the door of their apartment stood people, students, teachers, civil servants, writers, ordinary townsfolk. They came to say farewell. Some were silent, some read prayers, many brought flowers. The room where the coffin stood was open. The atmosphere was not ceremonious, but deeply personal, almost intimate. People felt that they were not saying goodbye to a mere writer, but to a man who had given them words for a pain they had never been able to express. The funeral took place on the 31st of January. The coffin was carried from the house to the Nikolskoye cemetery of the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. The procession was enormous. Witnesses wrote of 20,000 people, though in all likelihood there were even more. Students, philosophers, teachers, grammar school pupils marched. Some carried a portrait of the writer, others a volume of the brothers Karamazov. At the front they bore wreaths inscribed, "To the teacher of those who suffer, from grateful hearts," or "You revealed the light to us." There was no music, only the murmur of footsteps, prayers, and occasional sobs. At the cemetery, speeches were delivered. They were diverse. Some spoke of him as a prophet, others as a martyr. One student uttered a short phrase that would later often be quoted, "He suffered in our stead." A peasant who had made his way to the coffin quietly said, "Thank you, Batyushka, for understanding our soul." Anna stood beside her son. She held herself calmly, without hysteria. Later she would write in her diary, "It was not a farewell to a man. It was a farewell to an epoch." She understood that a new life was beginning, without him, but with his texts, which already lived on their own, breathed and resonated in the voices of others. After the funeral, a flood of letters descended upon Anna. People begged her to publish unknown pages, to tell about his final days, to pass on their words of gratitude. They wrote that his books had saved them from despair, that thanks to him they had again come to believe in the meaning of life, that he was the only one who had spoken to them honestly, directly, without condescension. Anna began to gather the archive. She reread manuscripts, prepared a collected edition. She did not sell a single page abroad. She did not allow anyone to alter his text without her consent. Everything he had left became part of her life. She preserved not only the papers, she preserved the silence in which he had lived in his final years. Years passed. The country changed. The empire collapsed. New ideologies, new slogans, new heroes arose. But Dostoevsky's books remained. People hid them from censorship. They passed them from hand to hand. They read them in camps, at the front, in prisons, in exile. For some he became a symbol of faith. For others, a philosopher of suffering. For still others, a guide into the depths of the human soul. Yet regardless of interpretation, everyone who opened his books felt that this was more than literature. It was a confession. It was a challenge. It was consolation. He departed quietly, but he remained. In chapters where pain speaks, in pages where compassion lives, in words that go on sounding even when no one is reading them aloud.